Honestly, with just a high school diploma, what can you possibly do? Go run an errand. Catherine's voice, sharp with irritation, sliced through the air at her daughter-in-law. Honey, don't get involved. Do you want to be humiliated? Have you lost your mind? Her husband Daniel wouldn't even meet her eyes, his own gaze fixed on the floor in shame. In this family, where Ivy League degrees were brandished like military honors, a daughter-in-law without a college education was barely considered human. Hundreds of distinguished guests and reporters watched from the grand ballroom. A multi-million-dollar contract was moments from collapsing. I'll handle the negotiation. At the daughter-in-law's words, the room filled with scornful laughter. But 1 minute later, the family hierarchy would be turned completely upside down. For the Caldwells, a prestigious university diploma was more than just a piece of paper. It was a coat of arms, a testament to the family's legacy. Walter Caldwell had built a respectable New York import-export firm from the ground up, leveraging it to expand the family's social standing and influence. In their world, one's alma mater wasn't part of a resume, it was the first and most important measure of a person's worth. Catherine, his wife, was a particularly staunch enforcer of this standard. The first thing she'd assess upon meeting someone was their university and their family background. For 6 years, she had treated her daughter-in-law, Elena, as an embarrassing blemish on the family's otherwise pristine record. Consequently, at every family event, Elena's role was silently but rigidly defined. She was to take the guests' coats, arrange gift bags, carry trays of canapés, and move unseen between the kitchen and the foyer. It was an unspoken rule that the daughter-in-law was not to participate in important conversations or business matters. In 6 years, Elena had never once crossed that line. Her husband Daniel appeared on the surface to be a calm and rational man. He was a person of few words who rarely raised his voice. But beneath that placid exterior lay the familiar cowardice of someone accustomed to avoiding conflict at all costs. Daniel knew Elena had lived abroad for a long time, but he'd never made a real effort to understand her past. It was simply more convenient for him to keep his wife as a quiet, docile daughter-in-law, a neutral figure between his Ivy League-educated parents and his younger brother. It made his life easier, but Elena had a life no one in the Caldwell family knew. As a child, her father was a self-made man in international logistics, and Elena grew up following him across the globe. She was more familiar with the inside of shipping containers and port authority offices in Rotterdam and Shanghai than she was with a traditional classroom. She hadn't learned foreign languages from textbooks. She had absorbed them out of necessity, a tool for survival. Standing by her father's side, she learned to deal with buyers, jot down numbers from contracts, and developed a practical business sense that was etched into her very being. That life, however, did not last. After returning to the States, her father's business partner embezzled their funds and the family's world collapsed overnight. Her father fell ill from the stress her younger siblings were still in school, and the entire weight of their survival fell on 18-year-old Elena's shoulders. With an acceptance letter to Columbia University in her hands, she made a choice. Instead of paying tuition, she had to earn a living. She didn't give up on college because she wasn't smart enough. She sacrificed her dream to save her family. But the Caldwells neither knew nor cared about her story. They judged her solely on the outcome, a high school diploma, and pushed her further and further into the quietest, most invisible corners of their lives. That fall, the company had a major event planned, a gala at the Plaza Hotel to celebrate its 30th anniversary and to formalize a massive partnership with a major overseas conglomerate. This was more than a simple contract signing. It was a stage for the Caldwells to flaunt their success with a guest list that included titans of finance, political figures, media, and fellow alumni. A week before the event, Catherine began issuing detailed instructions to Elena, checking the floral arrangements for the VIP tables, confirming the layout of the ballroom, arranging the seating charts. All of it was backstage menial work. Elena, your job is very specific. When the guests arrive, you will be at the entrance to take their coats and manage the gift bags. You are not to go near the stage or speak with any of the international guests. Understood. Catherine's voice was soft, but her words were steel, hammering Elena's place firmly into the floor. Elena lowered her head and murmured, I understand. It was the smallest voice she had perfected over 6 long years. Her brother-in-law, Justin, had eagerly appointed himself the lead on the event. Touting his MBA from Wharton, he boasted that he would personally handle everything from the dinner sequence with the foreign guests to the presentation slides. At family dinners, he openly declared that he would be the one to showcase the standards of a top-tier family. Dan, just leave it to me this time, Justin said with brimming confidence. From client relations to the presentation, I've got it all set up. Each time he spoke, Catherine's eyes shone with pride, a gaze that would then drift over to Elena, heavy with the weight of comparison. Elena was not ignorant of that look, but she kept her face blank, her eyes fixed on the checklist in her hand. One day, while organizing the attendee list and transaction documents, Elena's eyes lingered on a file from the overseas partner's side. A few translated phrases felt awkward, and some of the quantity notations seemed subtly off. Her fingers paused for a moment, but she decided it wasn't her place to intervene. There was a professional interpreting team and a dedicated staff for this. She quietly closed the folder. That evening, the Caldwells gathered to finalize the event's flow. Catherine once again cemented Elena's position. You'll be just inside the ballroom entrance, handling coats and gift bags. That's your spot. Don't wander off. Daniel said nothing. Not a word, not a look, to defend his wife. He just gave a slight nod. It wasn't agreement. It was habit. And Elena had long known how deeply that habit had pushed her into the shadows. After the family left, Elena walked the hotel corridors alone. Through a crack in the ballroom door, she could see the colossal chandeliers, the long red carpet, and the stage emblazoned with the company logo. She stared at the glittering space for a long moment before turning away. With a sense of finality, she folded the checklist in her hand and put it in her purse, reaffirming that the stage was a world that no longer had anything to do with her. Back home that night, Elena pulled an old file box from the depths of her closet. Inside the dust-covered box were business cards from her father's old overseas clients and faded contract memos. As she slowly traced the words on the yellowed paper, she felt a small tremor in a corner of her heart. It was a quiet, faint pulse, a reminder that the world she had long since folded away had not entirely disappeared. On the morning of the event, Elena arrived at the hotel before any of the Caldwells. She confirmed the location of the reception desk, straightened a tilted floral centerpiece on a VIP table, and double-checked the gift bag arrangement against the guest list with the staff. It was what she always did, invisible labor with a beginning and an end that no one ever noticed. She expected today to be no different. But 2 hours before the gala was set to begin, an urgent message came through the hotel staff. The overseas partners were arriving earlier than scheduled. Almost simultaneously, another report followed. The lead interpreter had been in a car accident on the Long Island Expressway and would not make it. The Caldwells' perfectly curated stage began to show its first cracks before a single guest had even arrived. When the news hit the prep room, the atmosphere instantly soured. Justin, who had claimed total control, began pacing between the room and the hotel lobby, his phone pressed to his ear. He frantically called one agency after another, but finding a top-tier corporate negotiator for a weekend gala on such short notice was impossible. Justin's face, so full of confidence an hour ago, was now flushed red, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through presentation notes and English summaries. The senior executives huddled together, but their best idea was to find an employee who spoke some English. This partner, however, was not one to be handled with a few pleasantries. They required an interpreter who understood not just the language, but the precise context of the contract. The fear that a subpar replacement could cause the entire event to implode hung thick in the air. Catherine, sensing the gravity of the situation, was primarily concerned with one thing: appearances. The problem had to be concealed before the reporters and alumni arrived. She pulled 2 staff members aside and spoke in a low, firm voice. Go outside and keep smiling. Act as if nothing is wrong. Not a word of what's happening in here gets out. Then she turned to Elena, who was standing by the entrance, and hammered the point home again. Elena, you focus on greeting the guests at the door. Do not come over here. The message was clear: this internal chaos was not for the daughter-in-law to see or know. Elena gave a slight nod and turned back towards the entrance just as she was told. Her husband Daniel stood in a corner of the prep room, watching the situation unfold. His expression was not one of action, but of hope that his younger brother would somehow fix it. As Elena glanced toward the prep room, Daniel frowned slightly and shook his head. That single look was enough. Don't get any ideas. Just do your job. Even in a moment of family crisis, her husband was still pushing her into the easiest, most inconsequential role. Standing at the reception desk, pretending to organize the guest list, Elena listened to the fragments of conversation drifting from the prep room. She heard someone say, the partners wanted to discuss practical details and review documents, not just exchange pleasantries. At that moment, her fingers stopped moving on the list. This wasn't just a missing interpreter. Her intuition screamed that if this continued, the entire event could collapse. After a moment's hesitation, Elena opened the door to the prep room and stepped inside. In a voice as quiet yet clear as she could manage, she said, I think some of the phrasing in the translated documents is a bit awkward. If the partners want to review them, it might become an issue. Every head in the room swiveled towards her. but there was no gratitude or interest in their eyes. Justin, his nerves already frayed, cut her off, his expression clearly stating that a high school-educated woman couldn't possibly understand business documents. A corner of his mouth lifted in a sneer. "Elena, now is not the time for that. The documents were reviewed by experts. It's chaotic enough in here, so please don't make things more complicated. Go back outside and do your job." The other executives turned away, dismissing her words as irrelevant. Catherine strode to her side. Her voice was soft, but the pressure behind it was immense. "Elena, be quiet. We have important guests arriving. If you step out of line now, you'll just make a mess of things." Two of Catherine's alumni friends standing nearby nodded in agreement, their faces showing unconcealed disapproval at the daughter-in-law's presumptuousness. Elena said no more. She pressed her lips together and took a step back. But as she retreated, her eyes remained fixed on the copy of the agreement lying on the prep room table. The discrepancy in the unit of measure, the subtle shift in a liability clause, a few phrases that were different from the version she'd seen days ago. She more than anyone knew how these small misalignments could spiral into major problems after the signing. Should I point it out now? No, they've already ignored me. Trying again will only bring more humiliation. The thoughts clashed in her mind. In the end, Elena said nothing, placed the folder back on the table, and returned to the entrance. Outside, a line of black sedans and media vans was already forming. Elegantly dressed guests began walking up the red carpet as photographers' flashes strobed from both sides. The Caldwells maintained a facade of perfect composure, greeting everyone with radiant smiles and graceful nods. But behind that veneer in the prep room, the critical problem of the missing interpreter remained unsolved, and the anxiety was mounting. Elena continued her duties, taking coats and guiding guests, appearing to be focused solely on her role. Just then, a hotel staffer with a walkie-talkie hurried over to announce that the partners' delegation had arrived even earlier than their revised time. Elena's gaze instinctively shot toward the prep room. Inside, she saw Justin hastily grabbing a young manager known to be conversationally fluent in English to act as a temporary interpreter. Watching that scene, Elena felt a cold dread creep down her spine. Being conversationally fluent and interpreting a high-stakes business negotiation were two entirely different worlds. She knew with absolute certainty that this reckless decision was about to cause an even bigger disaster. When the partners entered the ballroom, the tension became palpable. The initial greetings and exchange of business cards went smoothly enough, masked by polite smiles. But that was merely the prelude. The private pre-meeting began, and the partners skipped the formalities, launching into a rapid-fire series of technical questions. The young manager assigned as the impromptu interpreter froze after the very first question. Words came out, but his sentences broke off midway, unable to form a coherent response. Faced with a barrage of technical jargon and contractual terms, his conversational English was utterly useless. The lead partner's expression began to turn icy. From the hallway outside the meeting room, Elena couldn't see the scene directly, but the awkward silences seeping through the door, the sound of rushed footsteps, the anxious looks exchanged between hotel staff, it was more than enough. She could feel it in her bones, something inside was going terribly wrong. A few moments later, the meeting room door flew open. A few members of the Caldwell team stumbled out into the hallway, their faces pale. Someone's trembling voice cut through the air. They want to re-verify the key conditions before the main event. They said they can't go on stage like this. The words echoed down the corridor, and the air inside and outside the prep room seemed to freeze solid. Standing by the coat rack, Elena heard every word clearly. A slow heat began to build in her chest. She was the one in this hallway who understood most clearly that if things continued this way, the Caldwell's reputation and the company's contract would shatter simultaneously, long before the curtain ever rose on their glamorous stage. The situation inside the private meeting room was deteriorating by the second. The lead partner from the Swiss firm had stopped asking questions. Instead, he repeatedly opened and closed the portfolio in front of him, a clear sign he was searching for a reason to remain in his seat. Outside in the corridor, executives, assistants, and hotel managers milled about in disarray. No one offered a viable solution as the clock ticked down. Catherine's radiant smile, which she had maintained for the press moments before, was now a mask of irritation and fear. She grabbed a senior executive by the arm, her voice a harsh whisper. "You have to do something. If this event falls apart, our family's reputation is ruined. My friends from the Alumni Association are all sitting out there." The executive could only bow his head, unable to offer a solution. Catherine's primary concern was not the failed contract but the public humiliation. That priority itself was proof that she failed to grasp the true nature of the crisis. Elena continued to manage guest arrivals, moving between the ballroom entrance and the corridor near the meeting room. But she caught snippets of the conversation, drifting out the tone of the partners' questions, the exhausted silence as they waited for answers, the occasional exasperated English phrase. From those sounds alone, Elena knew they were past the point of simple frustration. The people in that room were already leaning towards pulling out of the deal entirely. This is heading in a much more dangerous direction than they realize, she thought, stopping for a moment in the hallway. This isn't just about the translator anymore. They're starting to doubt our side's fundamental competence. If they walk out before the ceremony, it's not a delay, it's the end of the deal. Seizing a moment when the meeting room door opened, Elena approached Justin. She spoke quietly, urging him to at least recheck a specific clause in the agreement, reminding him of the phrasing discrepancy she had noticed earlier. But Justin, already consumed by rage and a desperate need to save face, didn't even turn to look at her properly. Elena, I told you now, is not the time for that. We have a major crisis on our hands, so please stop interfering. His voice was a cocktail of anxiety and frustration, and that frustration was aimed not at himself for creating the mess, but squarely at his sister-in-law. None of the staff standing nearby paid her words any mind. Her husband Daniel saw her approaching his brother from across the hall, and his face hardened. He quickly crossed over, took Elena's arm, and guided her toward the guest waiting area. Elena, now is not the time, he said under his breath. What if you make a fool of yourself in front of everyone? Please just think about the family's image. His words struck her like a physical blow. The family's image. The phrase she had heard for 6 years now, being used again in this critical moment. She saw with painful clarity that what her husband was trying to protect was not his wife, but his own comfort. But Elena said nothing, allowing herself to be led away, her fists clenched at her sides. Even as she retreated, her ears were still tuned to the sounds from the hallway. She caught a short exchange between the Swiss partners, and the condescending tone they used when discussing the Caldwell team's level of understanding was unmistakable. The phrase hit her, and her fingertips went cold. Something inside her began to boil. It wasn't anger. It was a powerful resolution, a force pushing up from her core, telling her she could no longer remain silent. Soon after, the event coordinator announced that the ceremony was scheduled to begin and asked if they should proceed. But with the private meeting unresolved, the decision was made to delay. A murmur of confusion spread through the guests in the grand ballroom. Eyes started turning towards the entrance, wondering about the holdup. Whispers began to circulate among the alumni and business partners that the Caldwells couldn't even manage a simple international event. The once glamorous stage was losing its luster with every passing minute. It was then that Catherine called Elena over. Her voice was as smooth as ever, but it carried the casual authority of someone used to commanding her daughter-in-law. Elena, take some fresh tea and pastries into the meeting room. The mood is tense. Maybe this will help calm our guests down. Even now, her final resort was to use her daughter-in-law as a servant. But this time, Elena instinctively recognized the order as an opportunity. Lifting the silver tray, she bowed her head and, unnoticed by anyone, quietly opened the door to the meeting room. The moment she stepped inside, Elena held her breath. The scene was worse than she imagined. The Swiss partners and the Caldwell executives sat facing each other, their expressions radiating mistrust. The temporary interpreter sat drenched in sweat, unable to get a word out, while the lead partner, having received no coherent answers, began firing off faster, more specific questions, flipping through his documents. As Elena placed the teacups on the table, she immediately understood the crux of their interrogation. It wasn't about schedules or pleasantries. It was about liability clauses, the scope of conditions, the assignment of costs, the very heart of the contract. And several of the terms they were dissecting were the exact ones where she had spotted the dangerous mistranslations days before. Her heart sank. As she was about to retreat with the tray, her eyes fell on a specific sentence in the agreement. It wasn't a simple translation error. It was a liability clause that would remain in effect long after the signing, a risk that, depending on its interpretation, could cost the company millions. Leaving the room, Elena stood by a window at the end of the hall and took a deep breath. Outside, the lights of the hotel garden glowed, and a long line of limousines waited for the guests. She saw her reflection in the glass and remembered something her father used to tell her when she was a child. Remember, Elena. A single sentence can save a company, and a single number can destroy it. Her father's voice from a faded memory echoed inside her. She could feel her long, dormant, practical instincts, something she had suppressed for years, pushing her forward. Inside the ballroom, the delay was becoming conspicuous. The photographers had started aiming their cameras not at the stage, but at the entrance. The magnificent event the Caldwells had wanted to show off was now hemorrhaging prestige by the minute. Elena knew she had nowhere left to retreat. She slowly drew on the language and skills she had buried for so long. Just then, the meeting room door opened again and an executive stepped out, muttering in a shaky voice, "We might have to cancel the entire ceremony." The moment those words fell, Elena's expression changed. She calmly placed the silver tray on a nearby console table. And then she took a step she never thought she would take. One step towards the meeting room, and then another. She began walking towards the line she had never dared to cross in 6 years. As Elena stood before the door to the meeting room, it felt as though all the blood in her body had rushed to her feet. From inside, she could hear the sharp, rapid English of the Swiss partners and the faltering voice of the temporary interpreter, growing fainter. The very air seeping from under the door felt taut with tension. She could turn back now. She could return to the reception desk, to the coats and gift bags, to the familiar invisible role she had played for 6 years. But then, she heard the distinct sound of a portfolio snapping shut. It was the sound of the Swiss partners getting ready to leave. Elena's hand closed around the doorknob. At that moment, no one could have predicted that this single step would shake the entire foundation of the Caldwell family. The atmosphere inside was even more rigid than she had imagined. The Swiss team sat on one side of a long table while Justin and 2 executives sat opposite them. In a corner, the sweat-soaked interpreter was crumpling a piece of paper in his hand. Catherine sat at the end of the table, pressing down on her knees, while Daniel fidgeted with some documents, his eyes darting around the room. The Swiss CEO had his hand on his briefcase, a final gesture indicating his imminent departure. When Elena stepped inside, every eye turned to her. Catherine's narrowed, and Justin glanced at her for a second before dismissively looking back at his papers. Catherine spoke first, the force of her voice evident in the way she set her teacup down with a sharp click. "Elena, this is not your place. If you're finished, wait outside." Ordinarily, she would have bowed her head and left. But she saw the Swiss CEO begin to push his chair back, and in that instant, her father's old words echoed in her mind. A deal can break in a moment, but it takes years to clean up the mess. Elena met her mother-in-law's gaze directly and opened her mouth. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were clear. "Mother, I'm sorry, but please let me try." It was as if time in the room had stopped. The temporary interpreter dropped his pen on the floor. The Swiss partners turned their heads in unison. Catherine's eyes widened, her mouth agape, while Daniel half rose from his chair before sinking back down. Justin was the first to react. Sweat glistened on his forehead, but his voice was sharp. "Elena, this is no time for jokes. This is a technical negotiation. We need a professional." His words were laced with the certainty that a daughter-in-law with no degree could possibly have nothing to offer. A knot formed in Elena's chest, then slowly burned away into something hot. It wasn't shame. It was the feeling of something that had been hardened and calcified over 6 years finally starting to crack. But she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she shifted her gaze to the English documents on the table, replaying the Swiss team's final question in her mind. It was a sense honed since she was 15 at her father's side. Her body remembered how to react before her mind could even process it. Elena gave a polite nod to the Swiss team and in English addressed the core of their last question. Her sentences were short and precise. She articulated that their concern wasn't about the schedule, but about the specific methodology of liability distribution, adding a nuance that implied the Caldwell side was aware of and ready to discuss this point. The air in the room changed in a heartbeat. The Swiss CEO, who had been about to leave, paused and looked at Elena properly for the first time. As if testing her, he fired back a rapid technical question. Elena didn't falter. She grasped the intent behind the question and seamlessly translated the Caldwell team's position, framing it in a way they could understand. This wasn't just word-for-word translation. She was reading the room, identifying the source of the other party's anxiety, and explaining the context to the executives who for the first time seemed to understand the flow of the conversation. The Swiss CEO leaned back in his chair and reopened his portfolio. The man who was about to walk out had sat back down. Catherine stared at her daughter-in-law, her mouth half open, her fingers trembling slightly on her lap. Justin's reaction was even more pronounced. He who had spent 4 years in the U.S. and considered himself the family's cosmopolitan representative was now watching his sister-in-law lead a conversation with a fluency that far surpassed his own. He tried to interject by mentioning some statistics from his presentation, but the Swiss team was already focused on communicating through Elena, and his words simply hung in the air. Daniel was frozen for a different reason. It wasn't just shock at his wife's language skills. It was the sharp stabbing realization that for their entire marriage, he had never bothered to see this side of her. The truth hit him, he hadn't just allowed her to be a quiet person. He had trapped her in a quiet place. The negotiation was back on track. With each question, Elena provided context, reframing answers in a way that was both accurate and palatable to the other side. It wasn't just linguistic ability. It was the instinct to read the temperature of a room. That instinct, unused for 6 years, was returning to her completely intact. It was like opening the door to a long-shuttered room. It might be dusty, but everything was still in its place. The things inside Elena hadn't disappeared. They had been waiting. One of the Caldwell executives asked hesitantly, his voice, a mixture of awe and apology. "If you don't mind me asking, do you have a background in international trade?" Elena answered simply, "I watched my father's work for a long time when I was young." That one sentence carried the weight of years that needed no further explanation. Daniel quietly moved to the chair beside Elena. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. The scene unfolding before him was a more eloquent testament to how little he knew his wife than anything he could possibly say. Elena glanced at him for a moment. Her eyes held no blame, no forgiveness, but something else, something she couldn't yet name. Then she turned her attention back to the Swiss team. Outside in the grand ballroom, the reporter's attention was still fixed on the entrance. Whispers of something must be wrong were spreading among the guests. But inside the meeting room, thanks to Elena, the worst-case scenario, a cancellation of the ceremony, had been averted. The Swiss team began to organize their papers again. The men who were about to leave had stayed, and the closed portfolios were open. But Elena didn't relax. Her eyes kept catching the last page of the contract on the table. The discrepancies in the units of measure and the liability clause she'd seen in the prep room were still there. Just as everyone thought the crisis was over, Elena's finger stopped on a line in the contract. Everyone in the room was on the verge of standing up. Handshakes were being exchanged and a satisfied smile had returned to the Swiss CEO's face. But then a very quiet voice from Elena broke the moment. "One moment, please." Those 3 words made the air in the room freeze once again. The Swiss CEO lowered the hand he had extended for a handshake and looked at Elena. Catherine set down her teacup, her brow furrowing. Justin, leaning back in his chair, raised an eyebrow with a smirk. His expression clearly said, "What kind of show are you trying to put on now?" Elena slowly turned to the 5th page of the contract. Her fingertips were trembling slightly, but her gaze was steady. Under the fluorescent lights, the text on the page was starkly clear. Pointing to the quantity unit in the 3rd clause, she took a deep breath. Her voice filled the room. Her English was flawless, her sentences concise. Looking the Swiss CEO directly in the eye, she pointed out that the unit of quantity was recorded differently in the original document and the translated version. The original specified metric tons, but the translation had been changed to kilograms. This single difference was a fatal error that could result in millions of dollars in losses. The Swiss CEO's expression hardened instantly. He took off his glasses, wiped them with the end of his shirt, and looked at the document again. The lawyer sitting next to him also leaned in to inspect the same page. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper. Catherine shot up from her seat. Her face was flushed, her lips trembling. The saucer clattered against the table. She turned to Elena, her voice low but sharp. "Elena, are you trying to disgrace this company right here and now? That contract was reviewed by experts. What do you know about it?" Her voice was filled not just with anger but with profound bewilderment. Her eyes darted around, unable to rest. She was being forced to confront in front of everyone that the daughter-in-law she had always belittled understood the situation far better than she did. Elena gave a slight bow of her head. But she did not back down. Her heart was pounding in her ears, and her palms were slick with sweat, but she did not move her finger from the page. In her mind, she could almost hear her father's voice. "The contract doesn't lie. Numbers are more honest than feelings." Looking directly at her mother-in-law, Elena spoke calmly. "Mother, I'm not trying to cause a disgrace. If this error is overlooked, the company could lose millions. I only checked 1 unit of measure, but that 1 unit can change the entire framework of the deal." Her voice was not trembling. It was quiet, but it was firm. Everyone in the room seemed to be holding their breath. Justin leaned forward in his chair, his intervention clumsy. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he fumbled with the knot of his tie. He had been the one to give the contract its final review. If there was an error, it was his. "Elena, that's just a difference in notation. It's not a substantive issue." His voice strained to sound casual, but his eyes darted nervously from side to side. The Swiss lawyer looked up at Justin once, then returned to the document without a word. That single glance was enough to dismantle Justin's claim. Elena quietly shook her head at Justin. Then she turned to the 7th page of the contract. It contained the liability clause. The original stipulated that in the event of a defect, the supplier would provide full compensation. But the translated version had been altered to shared bilateral burden. This was not a simple unit difference. It was a mistranslation that undermined the very essence of the agreement. As Elena explained this second error, first in technical English for the partners, and then breaking it down in simpler terms for her family, the Swiss CEO slowly put his glasses back on and nodded. There was no anger on his face. Instead, a look of deep trust was emerging. He looked at Elena and said one short sentence in English. "Someone like you should have been in this room from the start." Walter Caldwell, the patriarch, had been standing by the window the entire time, saying nothing. With his hands in his pockets, he had watched the entire scene unfold. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, resting on his silver hair. He slowly turned and looked at Elena. A complex emotion flickered in his tired eyes. It might have been surprise, or perhaps it was regret. In a deep, quiet voice, he said, "You did well, Elena. You saved this deal today." That single sentence completely changed the atmosphere in the room. Catherine pressed her lips into a thin line and stared out the window. Justin lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the documents. Daniel sat in his chair and covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. The Swiss CEO stood up and offered his hand to Elena. She rose and took it. As they shook hands, tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she did not let them fall. This wasn't a fight for someone else's approval. It was simply about speaking the truth. Leaving the meeting room, Elena looked at the sky through the corridor window. Streaks of sunlight pierced through the clouds. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the hall, and from a distance she could hear the muffled sound of someone on the phone. Elena placed a hand over her heart. It was still beating fast, but she knew. What had truly collapsed in that room today was not the contract but the false order that hid behind the name of a prestigious university. Everyone in that room for the first time felt the truth. A person's value is not determined by the words on a diploma, but by the weight of the life they have lived. The reversal that began in the private meeting room became an unstoppable tide. Word spread through the grand ballroom that the ceremony once feared canceled was now rescheduled and would begin shortly. The anxious murmuring was replaced by a renewed sense of anticipation and suspense. With the corrected contract finalized, the Swiss team, their expressions now much softer, reconfirmed their participation. The CEO gave Elena a short, respectful nod, a clear sign of his trust. The moment the other Caldwell executives saw that gesture, their perception of her shifted. They all understood that she could no longer be treated as a peripheral figure. Justin rushed to review the stage sequence, trying to find a way to salvage his own reputation. But the truth was already seared into the minds of the executives and staff. The person who had actually saved the event was not him, but his sister-in-law. A reality more glaring than any stage light was closing in on him. Just before the ceremony, Catherine approached Elena and said in a low voice, her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "Elena, you've done enough. You can go to the back now and help guide the guests. The front seats are for family." It was a last-ditch effort to push her back into the shadows. But before she could finish, the Swiss CEO's executive assistant conveyed a request through the hotel manager, an official request for Elena to be seated on stage for the main proceedings. It wasn't about finding a seat for the interpreter. The CEO had specifically requested Elena by name. When the hotel manager relayed this in front of Catherine and Justin, Catherine's hand froze on her handbag. The daughter-in-law she had just tried to send to the back was now being summoned to the stage by their billion-dollar partner. She was speechless. Justin was in an even worse state. He had positioned himself as the event's director, the one who rightfully belonged in the spotlight. But the Swiss team hadn't mentioned his name once. The only name on the request was Elena's. Justin slowly lowered the folder in his hand, unable to hide the clenching of his jaw. The Swiss CEO offered no explanation for his request, but everyone who had witnessed the scene in the private room knew why. What mattered to him wasn't a fancy resume or a diploma. It was the person who in a crisis had made a clear judgment, who had read the intent behind the language, and who had changed the entire course of the negotiation based on facts, not emotions. The CEO had already determined that for this deal to remain secure, that person needed to be on the stage. Wearing a simple navy blazer, the hotel staff had quickly provided, Elena stood in the wings. In her hands, which moments ago had been handling coats and gift bags, she now held the corrected agreement and the event schedule. The situation felt surreal, but instead of nervousness, she felt the return of her old instinct for reading a room. It was as if the atmosphere of her childhood dealing with buyers at her father's side was gently pushing her forward. With the announcer's cue, the ballroom lights dimmed. After a corporate video played, the representatives and executives from both sides walked onto the stage under the glittering chandeliers. The sound of camera shutters was like a downpour. Elena was guided not to an interpreter's chair, but to a designated seat at the main signing table. As she sat, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her and met it head-on. The audience was filled with the Caldwell's alumni connections, business partners, political figures, and relatives. They had all come expecting a display of the family's Ivy League legacy, personified by Justin and Daniel. But the actual center of gravity of the event had shifted to an unexpected figure, Elena. That image alone signified a quiet overthrow of the family's power structure. As the ceremony began, Elena flawlessly relayed the opening remarks, the welcome address from the Swiss team, and the response from the Caldwell side. This was more than rote translation. She conveyed the nuance and tone, effortlessly moderating the atmosphere. The audience gradually began to see her as the central pillar of the event. Then came Justin's presentation. He started confidently clicking through his slides, but the situation changed dramatically during the Q&A. The first question from the Swiss team was a practical one that went beyond his prepared statistics. Justin fumbled with his notes, his words trailing off. With the second question, a bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. He clutched the microphone, and a brief, awkward silence fell over the stage. Elena quietly stood up. She didn't humiliate Justin directly. Instead, she chose to explain the context of the question in Korean, then framed a response that would allow the Caldwell position to be conveyed persuasively. She clarified that the core of the question wasn't about the delivery schedule, but about the standard for liability sharing. Only then was Justin able to continue. To the audience, her grace and composure made her shine even brighter. She proved that a truly capable person is not one who shows off, but one who saves the entire situation. Midway through the ceremony, the Swiss CEO posed an additional question directly to the Caldwell side. This time, he didn't wait for an interpreter. He spoke in English directly to Elena. It was a specific query about the implementation schedule for the revised liability clause and the assignment of personnel. This was not a question for an interpreter. It was a question for a business partner. The three Caldwell executives on stage all turned to look at Elena. The last shred of composure vanished from Justin's face. Without taking the microphone, Elena half rose from her seat and answered. She outlined a realistic timeframe for implementation, detailed the 3 key items their teams would need to coordinate beforehand, and naturally mentioned the internal reviews the Caldwell side was already conducting. Her answer was based entirely on fact without a single empty promise. The Swiss CEO listened, then exchanged a brief glance with his lawyer. He jotted something on a notepad and nodded. While some in the audience may not have grasped the significance of the exchange, the executives on stage understood perfectly. The Swiss firm had just designated Elena as the core communication channel for this entire deal. The photographers were no longer focused only on the contract signing or the handshakes. They were capturing Elena as she spoke, the Swiss team's reaction to her, and the hardening expressions on the faces of the Caldwell family. Those images would later serve as a clear record of who the true protagonist of the day had been. And so, the ceremony that had been on the brink of disaster concluded as a resounding success. But as the applause and camera flashes centered on a new figure, everyone was left with the stark realization that the star of the show was not the Ivy League scions the family had so proudly presented, but the high school-educated daughter-in-law who had always been kept in the background. The only question that remained was how this public reversal would shatter the power and relationships within the Caldwell home. At the reception, as wine glasses were being set on the round tables, the Swiss CEO's assistant quietly spoke to the hotel manager. The request was for the seat next to Elena to be kept vacant. The message reached the Caldwells in less than 30 seconds. Catherine's fingers trembled on her handbag. The power shift she thought had ended on stage was now continuing into the reception, the exact scenario she had feared most. The ballroom was filled with the buoyant energy that follows a tense but successful event. Warm light bathed the walls, and the crystal chandeliers cast tiny rainbows onto the glasses below. The air was a mix of flowers, baked bread, and the crisp scent of champagne. Business partners and reporters mingled, offering congratulations. A few journalists were already trying to learn more about Elena, asking if she was an executive, a relative where she came from. The Caldwells were too busy calculating how to explain their daughter-in-law's identity without losing face to even enjoy the success of the deal. As soon as Elena sat down, the Swiss CEO began asking her specific questions in English about the future work schedule and collaboration. It wasn't polite chatter. It was a clear acknowledgement of her as the primary point of contact. Two of the Caldwell executives tried to follow the conversation, but lacking the deep business context could only nod awkwardly. It became clear to everyone at the table that her role would not be a one-time performance. Catherine watched from a diagonal table. Her lips were smiling, but her eyes were hard. She gripped her wine glass so tightly her fingerprints marked the surface. An old friend from her alumni association leaned in, her voice, a low whisper laced with curiosity and surprise, her expression an unreadable mix of admiration and pity. "Catherine, I never knew your daughter-in-law was so fluent with foreign guests. Has she always been this capable?" After a moment of silence, Catherine forced a response, her smile brittle and her voice strained. "She was part of the support staff we prepared for the event. Our family is very thorough about these things." Her voice was smooth, but no one who heard her seemed entirely convinced. Another woman shook her head and murmured that her skills seemed far beyond support staff, more like a key player. The tips of Catherine's ears turned bright red. Justin stood with a few executives across the room, but the conversation had already moved on from him. A junior manager approached him hesitantly and asked, "Sir, does she have a background in trade? The Swiss CEO has been discussing business details only with her." Justin's jaw tightened as he adjusted his tie. He couldn't form a reply. He wanted to spin a story about how he had always known about his sister-in-law's abilities, but in front of the very people who had watched him fail to manage the crisis, the words would only confirm his own inadequacy. Throughout the reception, however, Elena did not use the moment to air past grievances or put the Caldwells in their place. Even when she sensed Justin trying to diminish her role, she didn't engage, focusing instead on maintaining the professional flow of conversation. She revealed no unnecessary emotion, moving only with precision and purpose. It was this very restraint that made her presence feel heavier and more significant than any overt counterattack could have. Midway through the reception, the Swiss CEO stood and raised his wine glass. The ballroom quieted. He scanned the room before letting his gaze rest on Elena. In a clear voice, he announced, "The main reason this agreement was successfully concluded today is thanks to one person who at a critical moment identified a crucial risk in the documents. And that person is sitting here with us." His words served as the final verdict for the entire room. A round of applause erupted. Whispers spread among the relatives asking why such a person had always been kept in the background. The direction of public shame had shifted completely from the daughter-in-law to the Caldwell family itself. At the end of the evening, a photographer requested a group photo. The Swiss CEO called Elena to the center. When she hesitated, he placed a light hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with genuine respect for the person who had navigated the day's crisis with him. "Stand here. You are the star of the show today." Elena took a breath and stood in the center. As the flash went off, Catherine was forced to stand at the edge of the frame, a strained smile plastered on her face. The irony was complete. The daughter-in-law she had tried to hide behind the entrance was now the centerpiece of the commemorative photograph. After the photo, the ballroom emptied quickly. Elena left after the Caldwells, pausing for a moment by a large window at the end of the hall. The evening sky was shifting from violet to indigo, and a faint smile touched her reflection in the glass. What had been revealed today wasn't just her fluency in English. It was the true value that had been obscured by a diploma, the strength forged by lived experience finally rising to the surface. The drive back to the townhouse was unnervingly silent. Just moments ago, they had been in a space filled with the applause and camera flashes of hundreds of people. The moment the car door shut, it was as if all sound had been vacuumed away. Only the low hum of the air conditioner filled the void as the glow of streetlights swept rhythmically across the front and back seats. Normally, Catherine would have been the first to speak, offering a critique of the event or a lecture on how a daughter-in-law should behave. But not tonight. She sat in the passenger seat, her handbag clutched on her lap, staring silently out the window. In the back, Justin was engrossed in his phone, saying nothing. In that silence, for the first time, Elena felt she could endure the family's atmosphere without having to manage it. She realized with a deep sense of clarity that, for once, she was not the one who needed to be on edge. When they arrived home, the cold light of the foyer flickered on, and the sound of their shoes on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud. After a moment of awkward stillness, Catherine went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The sound of water pouring into a glass echoed through the house. She took a sip, set the glass on the counter, and turned to face Elena. A faint smile touched her lips, but her eyes were cold and a sharp edge was hidden beneath her soft tone. "Elena, if you had these kinds of skills, don't you think you should have mentioned them sooner? Do you have any idea how shocked everyone was today?" The family's reputation was turned completely upside down. Her words weren't an acknowledgement of Elena's contribution. They were an attempt to shift the blame, to frame the day's events as a disruption of the family order caused by her daughter-in-law. The old Elena would have bowed her head and murmured, "I'm sorry." Lowering herself before her mother-in-law had been her survival strategy in this house for 6 years. But not tonight. Standing across from the kitchen island, Elena met her mother-in-law's gaze. Her posture was straight, her eyes unwavering. After a slight tremor of her lips, her quiet but firm voice resonated in the kitchen. "Mother, I never hid anything. You simply never bothered to see me." It was a short sentence, but it instantly froze the air in the room. Catherine's hand, resting on the glass, stopped moving. Her eyes widened. Her daughter-in-law had never, ever directly challenged her. The Elena of today had not only revealed her skills but also her refusal to be trampled on any longer. Catherine, unable to find a response, picked up the glass and set it down again before finally turning and walking towards her bedroom without another word. Her shoulders seemed a little less broad than usual. Justin, who had been sitting on the living room sofa, caught a glimpse of the exchange. He let out a forced laugh as he loosened his tie, but the smile was unnatural. He wanted to dismiss what his sister-in-law had done as a fluke, but he knew that calling an event witnessed by hundreds a fluke would only make his own Ivy League credentials seem even more hollow. Elena left the kitchen and quietly went to her room. She closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, unable to change her clothes for a long time. The memory of walking onto the stage, the feel of her finger on the contract, the look on the Swiss CEO's face, the eruption of applause, it all came rushing back. As the tension that had gripped her all day finally released, a deep, heavy breath escaped from her chest. She finally accepted that the skills she thought she had lost hadn't disappeared. They had just been suppressed for a very long time. The years she had spent pretending to be a quiet person to fit the Caldwell's expectations hadn't made her comfortable. They had made her smaller. And only today did she finally realize it. In her room, Catherine lay awake past 11, eventually calling Daniel and Justin into her study. They spoke in low voices, trying to figure out how to frame the day's events, what to do with Elena now, what to tell their social circle. But what hundreds of people had witnessed on the grandest public stage could not be undone by a private family meeting. Catherine knew better than anyone that it was impossible to put her daughter-in-law back in her old place, even if she couldn't bring herself to admit it. Much later, Daniel gently opened the door to their bedroom and sat beside his wife. He knelt to meet her eyes, his voice cracking as he finally spoke. "Elena, I never knew you were so incredible. When you tried to step in today, I stopped you. I kept telling myself I was protecting the family peace, that it was for your own good. But seeing you today, that was all an excuse. I did it because it was easier for me." His eyes were red and he wiped his nose with the back of his hand. The old Elena would have taken his hand and said, "It's okay." But tonight, she neither took his hand nor pushed it away. She simply said, "Daniel, I don't want to hear that you're sorry. I want you to show me. Show me that you see me for who I am, and that my place in this house is going to be different. I need actions, not words." Her voice wasn't cold, but it was resolute. Her eyes held both sorrow and strength. Daniel met her gaze, then slowly lowered his head. After the family dispersed, Justin sat alone in the dark living room, drinking a beer. 3 empty cans sat on the table, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of a streetlight outside. The reality that he had lost his presumed position as the family heir to his sister-in-law in a single day was something he replayed in his mind over and over, but he couldn't accept it. He had neither the humility to apologize nor the courage to acknowledge her, so his bruised pride dissolved into the bitterness of his drink. Catherine passed through the living room and saw her son. "Justin, that's enough. Go to bed," she said softly. He didn't answer. As her footsteps faded, he silently placed the empty can on the table. The next morning, the breakfast table was even quieter than usual. The only sounds were the hiss of the coffee machine and the clinking of silverware. Catherine seemed to hesitate for a moment before addressing her daughter-in-law, and the family's usual hierarchy felt strained off kilter. Elena sat and ate as she always did, but she didn't defer to anyone. She didn't speak, but she also didn't try to ease the tension with a polite smile. Her quiet composure alone was enough to make everyone at the table feel that her position had irrevocably changed. Catherine could no longer dismiss her with a single phrase about her education. Daniel and Justin, faced with the woman they had underestimated who had saved their family at its most critical moment, could no longer speak to her carelessly. And so, in the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Elena had not made any grand declarations, but she was quietly making everyone understand that she was no longer the person at the bottom of the ladder. By the next afternoon, photos and articles from the event began to appear online. The first to react were the Caldwell's alumni, friends, and social circle. In the shared articles, the most prominent photos were not of the contract signing but of Elena standing beside the Swiss partners interpreting with calm authority. The name of the family's celebrated Ivy League heir was nowhere to be found in the headlines. Instead, the face of an unknown woman was captured under the brightest lights. Catherine spent the morning fielding a barrage of calls. "I never knew your daughter-in-law was so talented. Why did you always keep her in the background? In the end, she was the one who saved the day, wasn't she?" The questions she most dreaded came one after another. With each call, her voice grew quieter, and her hand trembled as she held the receiver on the living room sofa. The woman who normally would have boasted was now cutting her answers short. Justin learned he was being compared to her at the office as well. At a morning meeting, a client partner casually remarked, "I heard the woman who handled the negotiation yesterday was your sister-in-law, Mr. Caldwell." The conference room fell strangely silent. Justin feigned nonchalance lifting his coffee cup, but his knuckles were white. He was painfully aware of how hollow his Wharton MBA now seemed next to Elena's real-world expertise. Later, seeing two employees whispering over an article in the hallway, he turned and walked away, the sound of his shattering pride trailing behind him. Daniel stayed home from work, sitting alone in his study. He stared at a photo of his wife in an online article for a long time. The woman he had only seen as small and quiet within the confines of his family was now being portrayed to the world as the most credible person in the room. A wave of shame and loss washed over him. In the photo, Elena stood next to the Swiss CEO, looking completely at ease. That natural confidence felt like a sharp-edged mirror, reflecting back at him everything he had erased from his wife over the past 6 years. Meanwhile, Elena was in a small room, quietly folding laundry. The stage lights and the eyes of hundreds of people were already a memory. That morning, she had made breakfast and cleaned the kitchen as usual, and none of the Caldwells had initiated a conversation with her. But she didn't find the silence uncomfortable. Before, she would have tried to break the tension with a smile. Today, she felt no need. Late in the afternoon, she got a call from her family. It was her aunt who had watched her grow up. Her aunt didn't offer effusive congratulations. Instead, she said in a steady voice, "Elena, you were able to do that because of what your father taught you." That simple sentence was more comforting than all the fawning praise from the Caldwell's circle. Looking out the window, Elena remembered the way her father's hands moved over contracts in his port office. As that memory merged with the scene from the meeting room, her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. That evening, Catherine finally called Elena into the kitchen. She stood by a cabinet pretending to look for a cup, stalling for a long time before she finally spoke. Her voice was much lower than usual, her eyes directed downward. "Elena, this business yesterday. Having people talk so much isn't necessarily good for the family." It wasn't an admission of Elena's success. It was another expression of her anxiety, a desire to push her back under the umbrella of the family's image. In the past, Elena would have bowed her head and agreed, but she didn't. She stood straight and met her mother-in-law's eyes, her voice steady as she replied, "Mother, I didn't step forward yesterday because I wanted the attention. It was this family that ignored and dismissed me until the very last second." The words hung in the air, and Catherine's hand froze. It was the first time in 6 years her daughter-in-law had ever spoken back to her so directly. Catherine couldn't hold her gaze for long. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. In that silence, she was forced to swallow the fact that her lifelong practice of judging people by their pedigree had been publicly overturned. Elena said no more. She left the kitchen, her heart pounding as she walked down the hall. She hadn't spoken out of anger. It felt as if a sentence she had held back for far too long had finally found its place. From that day on, while the Caldwells had not completely changed, they could no longer treat Elena with the same casual dismissal. Outside the home, the story of the daughter-in-law's competence continued to overshadow the family's pretense, and that was a narrative that would not fade overnight. The family was being forced not to ignore her, but to face her anew. Elena looked at her reflection in the window for a long time. The woman who had gathered her breath at the end of the hall before walking into the meeting room and the woman standing here now were the same person, yet it still felt miraculous. That realization alone had already made her world completely different from what it was yesterday. 4 days after the event, Walter Caldwell summoned Elena to his study. In the 6 years since her marriage, her father-in-law had never once called for her privately. Elena paused at the door, the very fact of her being invited into this room feeling foreign. When she entered, Walter was taking off his glasses and placing them on his desk. His expression was neither warm nor cold, carrying the quiet gravity of a man who had spent a lifetime in business. He gestured for her to sit, then took a long moment to organize some papers. The only sound in the study was the ticking of a clock. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, but each word was weighted. Elena, I was wrong. I'm at an age where I'm learning from my daughter-in-law that a diploma doesn't make a person. Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. A part of her wanted to cry, and another part wanted to accept his words with calm dignity. She settled for a quiet bow of her head. Walter seemed to take her lack of overt emotion as a sign of deeper strength, and nodded in approval. He went on to say that the Swiss CEO had formally requested a direct line of communication with Elena to manage the partnership. He intended to discuss it at the next board meeting, making it clear that her role could no longer be an unofficial one. Instead of thanks, Elena offered a short reply, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his directly. Father, I won't wait for someone to create a position for me. But if you give me the opportunity, I will show you what I can do. Walter paused for a moment, then nodded in understanding. When Elena left the study, her steps were lighter than when she had entered. She knew the weight of their conversation would last for a long time. After that, the family dynamic began to shift along a new invisible line. Catherine could no longer assign Elena menial tasks or try to push her into the background. When their eyes met at the dinner table, she would awkwardly look away. Her voice was a tone lower whenever she took calls from relatives, a change the whole family noticed. One morning, Catherine stood alone in the kitchen for a long time. When Elena entered, she stammered, then managed to say in a low voice, her face etched with the fatigue of someone who had lost a long battle between pride and acknowledgement. From now on, if it's something you can do, I won't stand in your way. It wasn't a sincere apology. But for a woman who had never once acknowledged her daughter-in-law's abilities, it was a retreat. And that alone was proof that something had changed irreversibly. Elena simply replied, "Thank you, Mother," without adding any further emotion. For the rest of the week, Justin actively avoided Elena. He came to breakfast at a different time and would quietly disappear into his room if he heard her voice in the living room. He had neither the humility to apologize nor the courage to acknowledge her, but he could no longer brandish his education as a mark of superiority. At the office, the image of him failing to answer a single question while his sister-in-law saved the day had cracked his Wharton heir persona, a fissure that only grew wider with time. Daniel wanted to close the distance between them, but Elena was no longer interested in returning to their old dynamic. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, he spoke first, his voice trembling with long-held regret. "Elena, I promise. I will never make you stand behind me again." Elena looked at him slowly. Her eyes held no blame and no expectation, only a quiet demand for him to show her with actions, not words. She looked down at his hand for a long moment before giving a single nod. There was still a great deal of time and healing needed between them, and she had decided not to rush it. The changes were clear even in small things. At family gatherings, Catherine could no longer relegate Elena to the kitchen. The way she introduced her and where she was seated changed noticeably. The woman who once carried trays of food now sat in the center of the living room, a natural participant in the conversation. The relatives who used to parrot Catherine's sentiments and praise Elena's quiet demeanor now asked for her opinion directly. At one dinner, an elderly uncle looked at Elena and said plainly, "If you hadn't stepped in that day, it would have been a disaster." As his words landed on the table, Elena didn't miss the way Catherine's chopsticks paused mid-air. These were small shifts on the surface, but they were proof that the deepest foundation of the family's hierarchy had been overturned. Elena accepted these changes not with quiet gratitude, nor with triumphant glee. She simply quietly and firmly held her ground. One night, Elena opened the old file box again. Her father's faded business cards, the contract notes scribbled in a port warehouse, the folded copy of her Columbia acceptance letter. In the past, looking at these papers had always made her heart ache. They felt like evidence of a path not taken, a constant reminder of the painful choices she'd had to make. But not tonight. As she looked at the papers, her eyes held not regret, but a calm acceptance. She saw them not as a symbol of her limitations, but as proof of the weight she had carried for her family. For the first time, she accepted this truth without wavering. She put the papers back in the box and stood before a mirror. The woman looking back had the same face as the one who had first walked into this house 6 years ago, but her eyes were completely different. The old eyes were filled with anxiety and a constant need to please. The new eyes held a quiet resolve to no longer hide who she was. Elena gave her reflection a small nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that she could finally let go of the small voice and muted expressions she had adopted to survive. From that moment on, Elena's life began to tilt away from the role of someone's daughter-in-law and toward the name of Elena. Daniel was still grappling with his regret. Catherine had not yet let go of her pride, and Justin was forced to confront his own limitations every time he met her gaze. But even that awkwardness was part of the process, proving that Elena would never return to her old place. The two dramatic reversals on that glamorous public stage, first her hesitant intervention that silenced a room, and second her correction of the contract that saved a company, had not only shattered the arrogance of a pedigree, but had also resurrected Elena's own life. And from that day forward, the biggest change in the Caldwell family was not how they saw their daughter-in-law, but how Elena saw herself. A person who decides to no longer be small will never again return to anyone's shadow. A person's worth is not defined by a single piece of paper. It cannot be contained by a label someone else gives you, nor by a position you are assigned. True value is forged in the invisible passage of time. The moments of sacrifice, of endurance, of holding on, those are the moments that ultimately make a person whole. What Elena proved had nothing to do with her fluency in English or her ability to read a contract. It was something much simpler: that the time you have endured will never betray you.